Hello, this is William R. Collier Jr. I'm with upadaria.com. That's spelled upadaria.com. A lot of people ask me what I'm trying to achieve or accomplish through the vision that I more or less include under the term upadaria. I want to explain how this is a vision of the future and how it's a future that can actually impact your life right now and open new possibilities to you that aren't really possible if your mindset is limited to the worldview of this current civilization. But I need to give you some background. The vision that I use the term upadaria to describe is a multifaceted vision. It doesn't just involve one thing or another, but actually encompasses a number of things. Now, when I first got this vision, it came to me in the form of a fiction story, which I'll talk about here. And through the years, I sort of would focus on aspects of the vision and what they meant, and I would get totally lost in that one aspect of it. And so it would change and bounce around and lead to all kinds of confusion for myself and for people who were actually around me and who were trying to help me in some way. It has taken me many years, if you consider from 1982 until today. February of 1982 is when I first really got the vision, and now we're over 35 years later, and I've finally gotten to a point where I really believe it's matured and ready for prime time, although time will tell if that's actually true. So what happened was that I had a vision which I didn't quite understand, being that I was young, and I didn't understand spiritual things as I do now as a more mature Christian after many years, and that I interpreted as a fiction story. And I don't believe that my fiction story is literally a prophetic story. I think that it shows what's possible in the future in terms of the dangers and the opportunities. It points a path toward escape from negative consequences, or totally an escape from the type of events that would occur if the nations, especially the ones in the story, continue to rebel against the truth. In other words, if they continue to promote ideas, practices, behaviors, policies that go against the laws of God, the laws of His creation, and at a more fundamental level, violate basic human dignity, basic human rights, there are going to be negative consequences. I'm not talking about God thundering down His wrath and destroying them and overthrowing them. I'm just talking about a natural consequence that just naturally will occur. So I saw the world laid out before me in the year 2147 AD. And what I began to get over the course of a few months was this unfolding story in different parts, focused on America, focused on Europe, focused on the world, that showed the history that had occurred from 1982 until 2147. And basically, it's a history of the coming of a new civilization and the collapse of other civilizations. Primarily, I focused on the West because I happen to live here. But within the vision, although not really central to the stories, was the collapse of civilization in India and China and a revival of sorts in Russia, which I think we're kind of seeing in terms of a cultural revival within that nation of people. So this history revealed very explicit details about how the people in this story lived, how they practiced community and family, how they lived in their relationships with each other, the economic bonds they formed, the institutions that they formed, which were completely different from the ones that existed in 1982, for sure. They weren't modeling Western styles, for instance. They weren't promoting the kind of radical isolationist individualism that you see in Western civilization today. They weren't modeling this world where it's basically an individual living in a community and they're not really attached to a lot of other people. In fact, in the story, Western civilization really loses more and more of that. And even today, you can look at studies. Just type it in online. Just the number of people you might be connected to on average. And so, for instance, whereas 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, people might be connected to 10, 20 different individuals. Today, that number is down to like 3. So the amount of connections we have with people on a face-to-face basis has gone down, which is something I wrote about in these stories that happened. So in the stories, this group of people that eventually emerges as its own new nationality, they intentionally try to recreate those lost relationships and connections with other people. And they have a formal way of doing it. You know, they have formal terms and names, which I really get into in the story, what they call themselves. But at root, they're trying to recreate these connections. And they do. They succeed in creating these connections with each other. They have no political ambitions per se. They have no desire to rebel or secede or any of those things. But as it emerges in this story, as the old system collapses, more and more people get involved with this new thing, which in practical terms is a society. But there are people that become part of this just by virtue of taking the ideas and creating their own communities and networks based on these ideas. So they don't necessarily all join an organization in order to be part of this nation. And again, it's a nation of people. It's not a physical state. So as they succeed in becoming more and more mutually self-reliant, and as the people around them in the larger society are experiencing collapse, their lack of services, power outages, famines, wars, all the vicissitudes that come on a civilization that is morally and creatively dead. So as these things are happening, people begin to gravitate towards this society and its organization and its structures. And eventually, actual countries do emerge based on these ideas. And they use the term Eupaderia as well, because it describes their system of government. So they are Eupidarian Crown Republic or Eupidarian Kingdom, whatever their system is. They just use that term as a descriptor based on the UPDR ideals. So, which I'll get into some other time. So they basically they fill a void. They fill a void. They gain influence and eventually even authority, but not by virtue of anything they're doing. They're not trying to do this. One of the stories is the fall of America. The society in America at the time is doing everything it can desperately to save the Union And ultimately, only a part of America really coalesces around this society. It just happens to be that most of the people in that region end up being members, and they form their own commonwealth, and they use the term Eupaderia to describe their commonwealth. Eventually, all these different countries that use that term and that philosophy form a global commonwealth that unites them and pools resources so that they can stand strong against a larger threat, or those kind of things. The story really isn't meant to be about that, although that's kind of a driving storyline in these fiction stories. Well, after I wrote all these stories, I then began to notice that there were things within them. And the first thing I did was looked at the system of government that was described. And I simply described it and tried to name its ideals and principles as best I could, and basically came up with a form of government, which I then learned. Then I kind of developed that into an understanding that, hey, this isn't just a form of government. This is actually something that could be useful to my life. Why, if I looked at these ideals and the principles, and I actually use them, I might actually, I might be more successful and more happy. I believe, and I've always believed, that the laws of science work for everybody who uses them. They are absolutely colorblind laws. They don't care about your past. They don't care about your ethnicity, your bloodline, your color. They don't care if you were rich or poor, if you did good things or bad things before. The only thing they care about, these laws of science, is whether you follow them. And so if you follow right principles, you ultimately will get right results. That's a truism. I learned that at a young age, and I'm glad that I did. But in these stories, I discovered a bunch of laws and principles and ideals, and I began to develop a kind of a philosophy based on them, a Christian philosophy, for sure, biblical philosophy, which I have later kind of modified into not just being a philosophy, but rather I like to use the term a lifestyle discipline or a governance discipline. Often I use the phrase a lifestyle and governance discipline, because I think philosophy kind of can sometimes be taken in a way that means, some theory of the meaning of life. And this is more of a discipline in the sense that you memorize certain laws and ideals and principles of cause and effect relationships, of how the world ideally exists according to, the laws of creation. And you try to conform your life, your relationships, your associations with those laws. That is the essence of what I then began to call Eupaderianism, based on using the four core ideals, which I now call the UPDR ideals, using these ideals, practicing them in your relationships and in your personal choices, and in all the other principles and practices that I discerned through studying these stories. So it's my intention to basically do for others what I did, is to share the stories and then use that to impart to people what the meaning of the stories are. So I don't mean to say that one day this thing called the Eupaderian Commonwealth of America is going to exist, and America is not going to exist as the United States of America. If anybody would read that story and think, Bill actually wants the United States to break up into small pieces, you're missing the entire plot. The whole plot of that story is that the people in the story are trying desperately not to let that happen. They're trying to keep the Union together. Because America, they believe, and I believe, America has a mission and a purpose to be the seed, to be the homeland of a new civilization that's based on these Christian ideals. And I'll break them down. They're unity and diversity, popular sovereignty, democratic equality, and rule of law. Now, when you hear these, some people are going to bristle at one or the other. If they come from the left, they might bristle at rule of law. If they come from the right, they might bristle at democratic equality. But when you understand these ideals from a biblical perspective, and big hint here, Romans 12 actually contains all of them. When you understand these ideals from a purely biblical perspective and how they apply to real life, you at once realize that they've been bastardized and abused and not held in balance with each other. I've shared these ideals, and at one point someone said to me that they amounted to America's spiritual constitution. And I actually agree with that. If you look at America, you've heard these ideals. But the problem has been that these ideals have never really been practiced completely, or they've been practiced hypocritically, and they haven't been practiced in balance and harmony with each other. You can't have democratic equality that equates to some version of social justice that amounts to wealth redistribution and trying to change human nature so that we are all non-differentiated beings, so there's no difference between young and old or between men and women or anything like that. You really can't do that. You're violating human nature itself. You can't change human nature. Nobody's ever going to. The Soviets tried to do that with their Soviet man. But when you look at democratic equality and you think of it in terms of Martin Luther King Jr., who said that we should not be judged by the content of not be judged by the color of our skin, but by the content of our character, you can see that there is a democracy of equal opportunity, not a democracy in the political sense of one man, one vote. In the strictest sense of that term, and to be honest, one man, one vote presupposes that every single vote from every single person comes from an equally qualified voter. And that's not true. We're not equally qualified. We don't all have the same knowledge or skills that will allow us to make wise decisions. And in a democracy, as our forefathers warned us, we tend to see the majority vote benefits for themselves at the expense of the minority. So it's not that kind of democracy, but it's a kind of democracy that is more spiritual and cultural, but also that is more related to the democracy of the marketplace. Pure democracy is a free market, because in a free market, it is your absolute equality of opportunity to go out and prove by your own merit what you deserve to have. That's the ideal of a free market. So democratic equality is necessarily a defense of a free market, but a free market that is fair and just in the sense that people are treated with equity. They get what they deserve. There are biblical objections and pronouncements against putting your finger on the scale, having unjust scales, as it were. That's not a free market when you have unjust scales. So that's just one example. I don't want to get into all four of them, but if you look at unity and diversity, popular sovereignty, democratic equality, rule of law, you'll find that all four of them have similar problems and also similar opportunities if you understand them properly. If you understand that not only that how they should be properly viewed in a biblical context, but how that all of your relationships and your associations should line up with these ideals. So that, as an example, you can't interpret or apply unity and diversity in a way that violates rule of law. You can't interpret or apply popular sovereignty in a way that it violates democratic equality. If you have all of these ideals in harmony, if your understanding of them is such that it doesn't contradict any of the other three, and if you're applying all of them in a balanced way to each other, then you get to a place of, I won't say peace, but you get to a place of lack of extreme conflict, we'll say that. I met someone recently who is really involved in creating communities around the world, and he told me that trying to create a community where there is no conflict at all leads to a loss of innovation and invention. So the four core ideals are not going to remove all potential conflict or competition. People are still going to be people. But what they are going to do is to keep that conflict channeled in a positive way so it is more competition than conflict. And also balance it with cooperation so people are capable of cooperating for their own common good. So the title of this is really the future, the envisioning this future. And I envisioned this global society that is a Christian society, which basically can be described with the words fraternal, missionary, and refugee. And by fraternal, I simply mean, if you look at what a fraternal society is, they have mutual self-reliance through fraternal benefits. And those fraternal benefits can be insurance for sickness or burial, or just mutual cooperation. People forming buying clubs would, for instance, be an example of a fraternal benefit. So a community of people that has this fraternal aspect to it, that they care for each other in a cooperative way, but also through the free market. They use the free market to their advantage to get benefits that are good for everybody, and each individual is primarily responsible for themselves, but at least knows that if they get in over their head, they're part of something bigger that will come in and assist them and bail them out if they absolutely need it. And by missionary, of course, we all as Christians understand that the Great Commission will go out, teach the nations, make disciples. So being a missionary is sort of living missionally, living as a missionary with direct intentionality towards bringing other people to Christ and making them disciples. And refugee is twofold, is viewing yourself as a refugee, understanding that we are just pilgrims in this earth, that we are just passing through. This is not our home. But also refugee implies, or in this case means, actually helping Christian refugees. Actual refugees, Christians who have fallen in crisis or who are fleeing persecution. So they might be internal refugees, people who live in the community but who, let's say, they're recovering from addiction or they've just lost their home to a fire. They're sort of an internal refugee. Or people who are from abroad or from other places that are actually fleeing war, famine, whatever. So this society forms around this mission of doing these three things, of taking fraternal care for its members. It's the idea being that if you are self-reliant, then you can't be controlled, and that you as an individual can never be purely and completely self-reliant. You need to be connected to other people. We were all born around other people. Nobody who was born by themselves or even kept themselves alive by themselves. You can't even live as a human being without another human being or groups of other human beings and their resources being used to keep you alive, because you're pretty useless. For a number of years, you can't really contribute anything. So that's the concept of fraternity, that we care for each other, which empowers each of us to be self-reliant and independent from things that would try to cause us to compromise. It's not a withdrawal from the world. It's not like you're living in a cave somewhere or you're going to create a compound and go live in it and become a prepper, and you're not going to go out and witness to your neighbors or go to work or attend a church or something like that. You're not doing that. But you're making yourself so self-reliant through this fraternal care, this fraternal community that you have, that you can't really be bought. And then the missionary aspect of it is that you're not just doing this, you're not having this fraternal community with other people just so you can have a better life and enjoy yourself. I mean, there's nothing wrong with people doing that if that's what they want to do, but that's not what the society was about. In the story, the society was about doing the fraternal thing so that they could go out and be missionaries and so that they could help people in need, especially Christians. So they weren't just trying to get rich and they weren't just trying to get comfortable. And again, people can form fraternal communities for no other purpose but to become self-reliant. There's nothing wrong with that. But that's not what the society that I envision is all about. It's about doing that so that you can go out and be a witness to the lost and so that you can help other Christians and other people in need as well. So that's where the future is, I believe. I think I saw this back then for such a time as this. Obviously, I think in 1982, when I told people that Western civilization was coming to a screeching halt, it was going to end, and that everything was going to collapse unless there was a dramatic change. There were some voices saying that, but it wasn't generally well received. People thought I was crazy, literally. But today, when I say those things, people don't think that's crazy because they're smart. They can see what's happening. They know. When you live in a society that literally is confused about whether you can be a man or a boy, a girl, a man or a woman, whether those things even exist, when you live in a society that thinks that marriage and the family are about nothing more than affection between two or more people who just like each other, then you know that your culture and your society has become so self-serving, self-pleasing that it's not capable of defending itself. It's not capable of perpetuating itself. It's going to go down. And then when you live in a society that can't say no to benefits, on one hand, people want the government to give all these benefits out, and on the other hand, they don't want to pay taxes. Which is it? Either you pay taxes to get the benefits, or you don't pay taxes and you don't get the benefits. But our society is really confused about that because people's minds almost seem like they're mush. And if you look back in history, you see that this isn't a new thing. What we call progressivism isn't really that new at all. It has occurred over and over again in civilizations under different names and guises. One writer, Oswald Spengler, referred to it as a world as spoil attitude. So they see the world around them as spoil, as something to be greedily consumed. If you think about what progressivism really is, at its root, it is about consuming things for your own satisfaction. Everything is geared toward your own satisfaction. Although the vehicle to make that happen is some sort of system of control and management for your own good. So, you can indulge yourself sexually in any way you like, as long as you understand that your bank account is not your own, nor is your land, nor is your house, nor is your car. Everything of physical substance belongs to the collective. The only thing you're really allowed to do is what we pretty much allow animals to do. Think about that. That's how you make people slaves. I am not, by the way, proposing that we go running around making all kinds of laws and tell people, who to marry or what kind of lifestyle they should live or anything like that. That's not my point at all. My point is the cultural aspect of it, that our culture is what it is, that in a higher culture, family and marriage are central to the existence of the nation and by extension central to the existence of the state, that the father and the mother raising their own children is the fundamental unit of human civilization at a higher level. And that when you remove that fundamental unit from the picture, you basically go backwards toward some kind of barbarism. And that's where we're going. Again, you can't stop people from choosing that. And you don't have to judge them in the sense of thinking they're bad people, because given the opportunity, human beings are human beings, and they will gravitate toward what pleases them. When you create a society based on a free association, and you make that society based on common standards and practices, it may seem like a weak force in the sense that you can't force anybody to do anything. The only thing you can do in a society like that is, tell somebody they're not a member. You can't throw them in jail or shoot them or, take violence against them. But the connection, that seemingly weak force of a covenant bond between people, even though it seems weak because it's completely voluntary, is actually stronger. It's like the gravity of the universe. Gravity is the weakest force, yet gravity is also the thing that holds it all together. So these covenant bonds are much stronger and last. When you do what Josiah did, you impose your will through the state, and you force everybody into compliance, or you're going to chop their head off or whatever. It's a very strong force, but it isn't long lived, and it comes apart very quickly. Put any pressure on it, and it's all going to come apart. So, going back to our subject, the future is a possible future in which Christians actually can form relationships and associations through something like what I'm envisioning, a fraternal society that has this missionary and refugee purpose, and that takes on the mentality, and this is important, it takes on the mentality that they're a nation. They're a distinct and separate nation in a socio-cultural context and in a spiritual context. That they are in the world, but they're not of the world. So at a deeper level, as Christians, we're all part of this Christian nation, the kingdom of God, spiritual Israel, however you want to call it. And we are not of this world. And yet God promised that Abraham would be the father of not one, but many nations. And so I would say there will be many Christian nations, among which the one that I'm talking about, the one that I envision with its specific ideas and convictions, is just one of many ways that Christians can advance and form their own national communities. Some of these communities may already exist. You may be a current ethnicity, and all the people that are Christian in that ethnicity kind of form a nation within that nation. But in terms of a society, and what I envisioned, people are going to be able to connect and form these bonds which have been lost, so that somebody who's part of a society like this is going to be connected to their non-believing neighbors. They're going to know people. They're going to be connected to them. They're going to be connected to Christians who aren't part of the society or who aren't part of their church, because the society's not a church. They go to whatever church they go to. So they're going to be connected to the greater Christian community in an intentional way. They're going to, because that's part of the ethos of that society, that we are part of the whole body of Christ. We are not an island unto ourselves. And then, of course, they're going to be connected to each other in that kind of familial way. So the average person who's a member of the society is going to probably have 10 or 20 very close connections. And it really comes down to is, if you can imagine, you get up in the morning and there's 20 other people who are near you. At least 20 other people who are near you. And maybe more that don't live near you, that you just happen to know. But that these people actually really fundamentally care about you as a human being. Let me tell you, I don't have a fraternal society that I belong to like this, like what I envision, or a community like I envision. But I practice these ideas myself. And because I practice these ideas, I actually can name you 10, maybe 20 people who I really believe fundamentally care as much about me succeeding as they care about them succeeding, and that I feel the same way toward them. Now, they're not connected to each other, and that's probably another step beyond this. But I'm just doing what I can as an individual. However, I will tell you, in the people ask me about being a prepper. I'm not a prepper, but people ask me about how do you prepare for these disasters. I mean, you're talking about disaster here, and why don't you have a cave and a bunch of supplies and a bunch of guns? And I tell them that, look, if you're a lone guy and you're out in the woods and live in a little cave with all your food and your guns and you don't have a lot of relationships, you're toast. But if you are somebody who has a lot of connections and relationships, chances are between you and all the people you know and that you're connected to, you're going to find the resources and get the resources and band together, and you'll be able to overcome any disaster. Well, we have never really faced the kind of disaster that preppers are worried about. But in my own life, I've faced some disasters that are prepper worthy in terms of their impact in my life. And I have to tell you that my connection to other people, my relationships with other people, is basically how I survive. Those relationships, I feed into them in terms of if I can do anything to help those people, if I can get them a connection or, get them a referral to help their business or help them, where I have expertise and they need something and I build a website for them for free or something because they know they need that. But they also do things like that for me. And there have been so many times when those connections were the only solid thing that kept me afloat because they gave me a lead when I really needed one. Or honestly, there have been times when they just came through and gave me they sent me money. Because I needed it, or gave me something that I absolutely need. Now, I'm not in a relationship with anybody where they do all the helping and I just take. I've done plenty for everybody in my circle. But my circle of people that I hold myself accountable to is pretty big. And it allows me to not go crazy, because I've got a lot of crazy ideas. It also allows me to weather a lot of storms and to achieve things that other people, they're just amazed that how did you do that? How do you get access to this or that? I could tell you a lot about my life and the things that I do. And basically, I was assessing, what could I show people and what could I show you who's listening? Here's what I can show you. I can show you how these ideas work. I can show you how you can apply them into your individual life and to whatever relationships are possible. And you will actually have a greater chance of success in life. You will have a greater chance to serve God and do things to help other people. And you'll be happier. You will be able to make your calling your career, something I talk a lot about. So that you get up every day and you do what drives you, what God put in you, and not just make a living. Not that you should quit your job just because you heard me say that. That's a process that you go through. From the time I understood this principle to the time I achieved it, there was definitely a lag. I think if I really calculate it, 13 years it took me. And that's because I was starting on my own and I had to do trial and error. I can show people how to do it faster because I've made the mistakes and they don't have to make those same mistakes. So the future that I envision is really the eventual emergence of a new Christian society that has the mentality that we are a nation of people in a social cultural context, in a spiritual context, and that is a missionary people and that helps refugees and that has fraternal care for its members. And that such a society of people spread all around the world would empower Christians to either A, be such a witness and influence that we actually prevent the type of catastrophes that I do believe are coming to Western civilization and to other civilizations. Or, barring that, to weather that. Now, I may not literally see all this happen, but my progeny, or my spiritual progeny, if it's not my own blood children, I don't know, but my progeny will have the resources and the knowledge that they can weather that storm. So it's either, prevent these things from happening or set up something that will help people to weather the storm if or when these things actually happen. And when I say these things, I don't mean in a prophetic sense of, in this year, according to the story that's happened. I mean these type of things. When I look at the story, if you see it and you read it, you'll see that there are things that have actually come to pass from the story that are uncanny. The refugee crisis in Germany, the war on terror, the war that happened in Iraq, the bombing of Sarajevo specifically, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the civil war in Yugoslavia, the reunification of Germany. All of these things, including the internet, although I didn't understand the internet when I wrote about this stuff, I described it in a funny way, but basically I envisioned a world that was completely connected, where you could very easily establish connections, communications with people around the world, and that you could instantly and cheaply broadcast your message to the whole world. Sorry, I was interrupted in the background there. Hazards of working at home. So that's kind of the future that I envision. People often take something that you share with them that's new, and they find holes, especially if you're just giving them a short explanation. I have over 1,200 pages of text that I could give you to explain everything. There's so much involved. And so if I give you a brief explanation and you find that there's a hole, the tendency that people have with something new is to take and look for those holes and read into it and say, I post things sometimes to this page and people will say some of the nastiest things that are so judgmental and so out of line and don't even come close to what I'm talking about. I've given up on even trying to deal with them. I just don't, because there's nothing to say. Yeah. So if you're listening to this and you find a hole and you don't understand, well, ask me. I'll explain it. And you still may not agree. I'm not saying that you necessarily will agree. I mean, we've got diversity of opinions out here. But I would ask you not to fill those holes, which necessarily exist in a short explanation, with presuppositions or uncharitable interpretations that, honestly, as Christians, we really shouldn't do to other people anyway. We shouldn't be looking at people in the worst possible light. We should be giving people the benefit of the doubt, assuming the best. We're not worldlings who basically only trust people unless they prove they can be trusted. Well, we trust people because we trust God. And we don't assume the worst about them because God doesn't assume the worst about them. So I'd ask you not to assume things at all about what I'm talking about. Yes, it's unusual. It is really unusual. I talk in terms of nations and societies and nobility and royal terms and regal things. And people they just don't sometimes get it. But what they don't understand is that the reason why all this nomenclature and all these other things is so different and jarring is because it's meant to be. Because it's meant to get you out of your comfort zone. It's meant to get you out of this mindset which has completely limited you. 1989, or 1988, I'm walking in Iceland, of all places, and suddenly, I always carry my pen and paper. Now I don't, I just use my phone, but back then I always had a pen and paper. And I'm walking, and the wind is howling. And if you've ever been to Iceland, you know it's windy. And I'm walking from one barracks to another place. I think I was going to a shop or something. And I suddenly got this thought. And I had to get in this little alcove and kind of conceal myself from this wind and write these words. And I'm going to say these words to you. I said, too often we're limited by the narrow scope of our personal experiences rather than being liberated by the unlimited horizon of God's possibilities for us. The narrow scope of your experiences is what you bring to the table when you see somebody like me and an idea like this. And you say, I have never in all of my experience had anybody tell me, let's start a new Christian nation. What do you mean? Are we going to get in boats like the Pilgrims and take over Native American land or something? The narrow scope of your personal experience will hold you back from new possibilities. And if you consider the world in which you live, there was a time when if I described that world, people would look at me like I was a heretic. If in 1500 you described the society in which we lived, I don't mean just the technology. If you said people don't have to, go outside to go to the bathroom, they go to they all have indoor plumbing, they all go to the bathroom. There's this empire and it's, 3,000 miles wide and you can go from one end to the other and be safe. And yes, there are places where you're going to see criminality, but for the most part, if you avoid the bad areas, statistics are that you're going to be safe and that isn't being attacked and isn't ruled by a bunch of warlords, and that most people live to be 80 years old. And people can pretty much say what they want to say and live the way they want to live. There are certainly threats to our liberties, which we could talk about. But yeah, you compare to, if you want to live the life of a serf in 1500s Germany, good night. So if I explain this world of possibilities, but you see, there were men back then and women back then who had a vision of a different future. The future they saw was not on the trajectory of the society in which they lived. The Pilgrims that actually did come to America envisioned a different future and built it. I envision a different future that is not on the trajectory of our current society. That seems odd, that seems strange, and it seems jarring. It is outside of the narrow scope of your experiences. Now, if you study history, you'll see that it's definitely not outside the scope of human experiences. It's quite within that scope. What? New nations, they emerge. New civilizations, they emerge. Everything that exists now didn't exist at one time. So the challenge, if you want to see a possible future that's better than the one that our society is moving toward, which is a regression backwards toward the 1500s and towards barbarism, that the society in which I envision is more egalitarian without being collectivist. The society that I envision has more virtue, but also isn't legalistic. The society that I envision isn't a bunch of people that are wealthy grubbers who are just consuming upon their own lust, but nobody lacks for any good thing. The society in which I envision, spreading all over the world here and there, that society, that possible future, doesn't look like this society that we live in today. Why would I want to reproduce what almost everybody listening to this understands is corrupt and failing? Why would I want to limit my possibilities to the last 50 years or the next 50 years? What the Pilgrims did, what William Penn did in Pennsylvania, he described that he had the seed of a nation. What they did was create something that they never lived to see the benefit of, that you and I lived to see the benefit of. And so that's what I'm looking to do. I'm looking to find people who come together around this idea and who understand that we are not building something so we can be satisfied. Yes, we will be more self-sufficient, but we're trying to build a possible future that is better than the trajectory of the society in which we live, that's going to allow people to escape those consequences, and yet also that is going to allow those same people escaping those same consequences to continue to be a witness to their neighbors and their friends who are still caught up in that society. I'm not talking about a retreat into the woods. I have a passion for seeing the lost converted. And that passion is going to be part of this society if I live to see it exist. And that's the other thing. I don't even know if I'll live to see it exist. I may just spread the ideas. I may never live to see this exist. And I'm fine with that, because I feel like if I proclaim it and write about it and teach it and show it to other people, that I'm actually fulfilling my purpose. And that's not the only purpose that I have in life. I have other things that I do too that are part of God's purpose for my life. That's not the only thing. My grand purpose, of course, is just to follow Jesus. That's enough, isn't it? But in following Jesus, there's all kinds of things that he has put on my plate. This is just one of them, but it's a big one. And so, as you consider a possible future that I've laid out, understand that it's not within the narrow scope of your experiences. And that the world that you live in was once a possible future that was not within the scope of the narrow experiences of the people who first envisioned it. This is how the world moves. This is how history moves forward and not backward. Well, I thank you for your time. I will be posting this through YouTube on my channel, and I'll share it, and hopefully enough people listen to it. But I'll continue to talk about this and try to break it down to things that are helpful to you, like how do you use the 4 core ideals to decide if your relationship is healthy or not? How do you use them to decide if your business choice is a good choice? All these things are things that I'd like to talk about and share with you. So this has been Bill Collier, or William R. Collier Jr. is called, and I thank you for your time. Signing off.